down and see my people through.
Gorgeous, gorgeous music. Oh my God. Amen indeed. Good afternoon, everyone. A bit of a preface before I formally begin the sermon. We just heard an earlier text from the good Reverend Dr. MLK Jr., where he was critical of liberal religion, as a member himself of progressive religion. Some of the ways he was speaking were endemic of the 50s and 60s and maybe uncomfortable. And I was not comfortable with changing a single word of his writing. All that said, you will always find me quote the writings of Dr. King that make some, or maybe all of us, possibly, maybe, uncomfortable. He was a prophet, and that means he's challenging norms, and we need to honor that. Unfiltered, because he had something very powerful to say, a lot of somethings. Today's service is honoring the work and ministries of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther K. Jr. In his honor, we will be looking faithfully at the challenges today and horrors today of white nationalism and fascism. And we'll slowly lean into that, as you'll shortly see. I'll begin with the story and shift into the message. I learned something about eagles not that long ago. You see them a lot on car commercials. When the company wants to sell power or patriotism, the car zooms by, probably on a majestic curve at high speeds, a totally realistic portrayal of drivers out here, by the by. And then an eagle soars overhead, and you hear the majestic cry of the symbol of our nation. The only problem is that the bird cry we hear is that of a hawk, not of an eagle. Hawks sound more like powerful predators to our ears, to most of our ears, and so all the voiceovers swap in hawk sounds. Eagles sound like most other birds. They have this high pitch but cute range of sounds. They even can make a noise that, to my ear at least, sounds almost like the laugh of a hyena. Cute, sure, but not powerful. I totally get why companies would swap out the sounds to sell more cars. Power and patriotism are strong motivators for our consumerist culture. But it's so pervasive that it took me more than 40 years of my life to learn what our national emblem, our national mascot, animal, sounds like because of capitalism. I'm not sure I can think of a better metaphor for our national crisis than this. We identify nationalism with patriotism, and patriotism with force and power, and we overlay that with our national emblem, the eagle. I remember as a kid learning that Benjamin Franklin wanted our national emblem to be the turkey, because wild turkeys are apparently one of the most intelligent birds. He lost out to an apex predator, and the eagle won't do today if it sounds like a laughing hyena. So we make it sound like what we value, power. It's the modern trinity, our contemporary idolatry, power, patriotism, and purchasing power. We like power so much we say it twice. As we risk slipping toward fascism in our nation, and I don't use that word lightly, as a reminder, fascism is a political ideology that seeks, one, to centralize capital, make the rich richer, demonize a racial, ethnic, religious, or sexual or gender identity, think Muslims, Arabs, Latinos, or the LGBT communities. 3, usually uses protectionist economic policies to create the illusion of national self-sufficiency. We saw that recently in our last office. 4, a disdain for democratic norms, which we see alive and well today in the attacks on voting rights, which the family of Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Martin Luther King, has asked that we use this holiday to remember the sanctity of voting rights. And 5, the call for increasing militarism. We know that too well. As we slip toward fascism, as I said, knowing our history, naming a thing for what it is, and a rigorous quest for facts become more and more critical to our democracy. This is why learning that I've been taught, maybe we all have been taught, that I've been taught a lie about what the eagle sounds like bothers me so. And why that lesson is so important as we enter into this sort of post-fact era in our nation's story. Changing the voice of the eagle to match our need for power in our patriotism is the spirit of our times, the zeitgeist for today. In our post-fact era, we demand reality conform to our opinions. This is most prevalent in the rise of white supremacy on our streets. Whites are beginning to shift into the minority in our nation demographically, and whites haven't been the global majority ever. And as equal rights are gaining enough ground that folks who have historically enjoyed privileges at the expense of others begin to have their privileges leveled. White folk, men, heterosexuals, that leveling is experienced as oppression in our wider society, or confused as oppression. And with being treated more equally than before, white supremacy surfaces in the broad daylight again, never gone, always dangerous, but more obvious, at least, more obvious to white America these days. It's harder to hide from. The clarion call of the commercialized, patriotic, bald eagle, always strident, never nuanced, and speaking with someone else's voice, in order to sell a set of goods, could be the perfect emblem for this rise of white nationalism. I'd mock it if it weren't so deadly dangerous to the fabric of our nation and our people and our world. Religion today, at its best, needs to address the dangers of this post-fact era. It needs to do its part in staving off the worst excesses and inoculating our children from growing up believing in this dangerous nonsense, dangerous, deadly nonsense that props up bellicose lone male figures as powerful when they are merely petty, as charismatic rather than charlatans, as populist when they mean white nationalist. Confusing opinion with reality, especially when those opinions are universally used to benefit some at the expense of the majority of others. What is faith to do in response to all of this? What is faith to do in response to all of this? This central problem to our religious life is explored by the theologian Dr. Ada Maria Sassi Diaz, although she's writing around the turn of this century and exploring the nature of oppression, belief, and justice. She would expand the discipline of liberation theology, and for those unfamiliar with that phrase, liberation theology was brought about, I think, arguably by Dr. James Cone, who's a professor of mine before he died, the father of African American liberation theology, but liberation theology in general. And the idea was that God is always on the side of the oppressed. That's the long and the short of it. There's so much more, so many books, so many thoughts, but God is always on the side of the oppressed. So she would expand that discipline of liberation theology and center the experience of Latino women as a community, not individuals, but as a community. This branch of contemporary theology is known as Mujerista theology. You'll hear me talk about it down the line, I'm sure, in other sermons. Mujerista. She would argue that, and these are her words, new narratives help us to see and to value parts of ourselves that we have ignored or that we do not know well, and they help us to know ourselves differently from the way oppressors defined us. I'll say it one more time. New narratives help us to see and to value parts of ourselves that we have ignored or that we do not know well. And they help us to know ourselves differently from the way oppressors define us. Her theological concept of lo cotidiano seeks to recenter the stories of everyday struggles as a primary source for faithful reflection. What happens around the kitchen table is key to our spiritual life, not beside the point. In our post-fact era, knowing our own stories becomes even more critical as the forces of oppression and hate continue to literally make everything up as they go. Professor Diaz writes, as social beings, we are called to relate to all those around us, and this we can do in a non-discriminatory way only if we emphasize what connects us, if we understand the injuries produced by exclusion and isolation. Decentralizing ourselves, she says, would help us to be cognizant of what connects us. And to do this, we must stop making ourselves the point of reference. She'll go on to explain this with an example of what she calls boomerang perception. And if this is familiar to you, I totally understand that. She was also, again, writing 20 years ago. And there's a lot of ways in which she was a foundation for a lot of modern thinking in the progressive movement. She gives an example of a white mom who sends her daughter to her first day of school. When her daughter comes home, she mentions that she has an Hispanic classmate. Quoting, not wanting her daughter to be racist, the mom reassures her by telling her that there is nothing to worry about, that the little Hispanic girl is just like she is. It's very difficult to imagine that such a mother in today's society would tell her daughter, do not worry, you are just like that Hispanic girl. The mother's comment reasserts the centrality and normativity of the dominant race and culture. In other words, who is the standard? Who's the norm? Is the white girl the norm? Is the, as Dr. Diaz said, Hispanic girl the norm? And how we talk about that, who we center as the norm, changes our general perspective. Whose stories get centered and whose stories get a forced makeover is the dominant challenge of faith in our post-fact era. Dr. Diaz is talking about race, for sure. And it's especially relevant to the rise of white nationalism on our streets and in Congress. And we can also make room for the reality that white supremacy is also patriarchal and sexist. Reasserting the centrality and normativity of the dominant race and culture isn't only along race lines, certainly is, but not only. Sexuality, family makeup, and gender all experience this. I recall in my former career of information technology 20 or so years ago, when my supervisor, a woman, and I would go out in the field to solve a more complicated problem, both of us equally skilled, and she was in charge, people would often turn to me, the man in my 20s, for the second or final call rather than take the opinion of my female supervisor. I recall getting in the habit when that would happen of turning my body to face my female boss and wait for her to answer again. I remember my godmother, back when I was a kid, she was also my cousin, but old enough to be a godmother. She was the second certified female electrician in New Jersey, the second. She finally gave up the career because she got sick and tired of going on to the same work sites day after day and being asked to prove she was who she was to do the job as if they didn't see her every other day of the year. She went back to school again to be a nurse, from all that dominant culture reasserting its norms. Even our denomination can be guilty of this. We often celebrate that like over 60% of our clergy are women and about 20% of our clergy are LGBT or Q, far ahead of, I believe, still all other mainline denominations. But both women and LGBT ministers are in the extreme minority when we look at which ministers lead our largest congregations. It's a problem for us too. So let's all be careful. Let's all be vigilant to what story or whose story gets centered over and over again, because it has real repercussions in our everyday experiences. And right now, it appears that a white nationalist story is getting centered more and more. One role of faith in our lives is to push against this. We're all healthier for learning from the range of human experiences. We are spiritually more whole the more we are pushed to not center our own perspective as object reality. It can be a spiritual practice to bear witness to the witness of others. Compassion for the sake of compassion is a religious expression. It's also the path to building the beloved community, even and especially within this troubling time. Dr. Ada Maria Sasidia's theology is an especially good answer to the poison of white nationalism, where white nationalism props up an individual racial group as superior and powerful, as sincere as the eagle dubbed over with a hawk's cry. Dr. Diaz focuses her theology on what she calls lo cotidiano. It's a Spanish word. There's a few different translations. The way she translates it is everyday struggles. You might find it to mean routine or common practice, as in our everyday doings and strivings of everyday people. It's that those complicated words Dr. King used earlier. If I remember right, he used unsophisticated, which is a language that would be very uncomfortable to me, but he was also speaking at that time in his papers in the 50s and 60s, and that the word may have had a different meaning than we hear it today. So I'm in no way critical of it. But I think he's talking about this too. Lo cotidiano has to do, in the words of Dr. Diaz, has to do with the simple reality of life, to those immediate necessities, to the crises that grassroots people have to face daily, and to the wisdom they show when, in some way or other, they survive. So theology, when it comes down to it, is how we make and understand meaning in our lives. And I'll back up a moment. Dr. James Cone, my first day of systematic theology, he's a pretty conservative theologian, although he's a progressive minister, would say theology is how we make and understand meaning in our lives. How we make and understand meaning in our lives. Dr. Diaz is asking us to do theology based on the everyday struggles for life and meaning to survive, rather than the stories of power and privilege we are too often raised to lift up. Faith in a post-fact era is being in relationship with and bearing witness to the pain caused upon those most impacted by the degradations of power and privilege. I think about the work of so many years here at Community Church, hosting our shelter guests, centering the needs and stories of someone other than ourselves, or maybe ourselves, when we're at our most vulnerable. Or with you used nationally. I think about all who are part of rapid response networks, or like my former congregation I just left 2 weeks ago, which built a rapid response network in the center of Long Island from the ground up, literally agreeing to bear witness and accompany an immigrant facing an immigration court, centering someone else's story, and in the act of bearing witness, not only are we helping someone feel less alone and lost in our system, but research shows that judges rule more favorably toward immigrants who have connections to the community. Faith in this post-fact era may not be able to argue our way to people believing facts again over opinions, but we can do our part in reknitting community by bearing witness to people and their everyday struggles. We may not be able to argue our way through, but we can be the models for the world we want to create. Amen, and blessed be.